The stars twinkled across the vast expanse of space. The Galactic Empire had long ruled with power, spreading its influence across countless systems. But something was about to change. A new force had arrived, one that the Empire had never seen before. The Terran Fleet, a mysterious collection of human warships, had come from beyond the Empire's borders. The first signal appeared on the scanners. It was faint, almost like a whisper in the emptiness of space. But it was there. The Empire's military officers looked at each other in confusion. The Terrans had always been a minor species, nothing to worry about. At least, that was what they thought. Now, as the signal grew stronger, they realized something was different. The fleet appeared on the edge of the Empire's territory. The ships were sleek, not large like the Empire's warships, but they had a sharp, dangerous edge to them. They moved without hesitation, like a predator stalking its prey. The Empire's sensors couldn't pick up anything else, no weapons, no clear intentions. Just ships, moving closer. A low hum filled the control room as officers ran their scans again. The ships didn't show up on most systems. There was a problem. This wasn't normal. "Prepare for contact," the commander ordered. His voice was calm, but there was fear in his eyes. The Terran ships weren't broadcasting any signals. No demands, no warnings. They just came, silent as shadows. The Empire had dealt with many species, but nothing like this. The Terrans were different. Their ships, though small, felt far more powerful than they should. The commander couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "Activate shields," another officer said, his hands trembling. The silence was unbearable. The fleet kept moving forward, inching closer to the heart of the Empire's space. The Empire's defense systems were ready, but no one knew what to expect. The commander watched the fleet through the large windows of his ship. The Terran ships, though outnumbered, didn't seem to be afraid. They just existed. They seemed confident, even calm. As the Terran fleet approached, the Empire's flagship, a massive warship, prepared to defend the Empire's honor. It was the largest ship in their entire fleet, and it was equipped with the most advanced weapons. Surely, the humans couldn't expect to defeat them with just a handful of ships. The Terrans must have been foolish to come this far. Yet, as the flagship powered up its weapons, something unexpected happened. The Terran fleet stopped. They didn't fire. They didn't retreat. They simply stopped. The silence grew heavier, pressing in from all sides. The Empire's commanders looked at each other, confused. What was the meaning of this? Why didn't the Terrans respond? Moments passed, but it felt like hours. The Empire's ships were ready to attack, their weapons aimed at the incoming fleet. But no one gave the order. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The Terran fleet had arrived, but what were they here for? The answers remained unknown, and the entire galaxy waited in suspense. The Empire's flagship floated in the vast emptiness of space, its massive form casting a long shadow over the fleet of Terran ships. The tension in the air was palpable, as every officer on board held their breath, watching in silence. The human fleet had stopped, not advancing any further. They were waiting. But what for? What could be the purpose of this eerie stillness? "Commander," one of the officers spoke nervously, breaking the silence. "Should we make contact? They're just sitting there." The commander stood at the front of the control room, his eyes locked on the view screen, where the Terran fleet hovered like a gathering storm. The silence from the Terran ships was deafening. No signals. No demands. Nothing. It was as if the humans had no interest in starting a conversation. The commander felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unnerving about the stillness. Something wrong. "Not yet," the commander replied, his voice calm but his thoughts racing. "Prepare the weapons. But don't engage. We need to understand their intentions first." He turned away from the screen and looked out of the large windows of the command deck. The Terran fleet wasn't large, not in the way the Empire's fleets were. Yet there was something about them that felt dangerous. The humans had only a handful of ships, but their movements spoke volumes. Every ship in the fleet was perfectly coordinated, as though they had been practicing for this moment for years. The Empire's military had never been one to back down. For centuries, they had crushed any opposition with overwhelming force. But here they were, on the edge of their territory, facing an enemy that didn't respond to threats. Didn't speak. Didn't act. Just waited. "Why are they just sitting there?" the officer beside the commander whispered, as if the question were too heavy to voice out loud. The commander did not have an answer. He had no idea why the humans weren't reacting. Why were they not attacking? Why didn't they respond to the fleet's hails? It didn't make sense. Humans had always been known for their aggression, their desire to conquer, but these Terrans, these humans, were different. Their ships weren't like anything the Empire had ever seen. Sleek and powerful, yet small. They moved like predators, with purpose, but now they simply floated in silence. On the Empire's flagship, the tension was unbearable. Officers whispered to each other, speculating on what might happen next. Some believed it was a trap. Others feared it was a test of some kind. Could the Terrans be trying to see how far the Empire would push before breaking? Hours passed, and the Terran fleet remained unmoving. The Empire's warships were ready, their guns powered, their shields activated. Yet the order to fire had not been given. The commander paced back and forth, trying to understand the situation. There had to be more to this than a mere show of power. The humans weren't acting like invaders. They were waiting, watching. What was their game? Finally, a soft hum broke the silence of the bridge. A message had come through. Finally, the commander muttered under his breath. He signaled for the message to be displayed on the main screen. Everyone in the room held their breath as the words flashed across the screen, "We are the Terrans. You are in our way." The words were simple, but they struck like a blow. The human fleet wasn't here to negotiate. They weren't here to conquer. They weren't here for any reason the Empire could have predicted. They were here because the Empire was standing between them and their goal. The commander's mind raced. What could this mean? The Terrans were not threatening war, but their message was clear: the Empire was now a barrier to something far bigger. "What do they mean by that?" an officer asked, his voice trembling. The commander didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, now filled with the image of the Terran ships. No words. No demands. Only the cold, steady assurance that the Terrans had come to make a statement. But what was that statement? "Ready the fleet," the commander ordered. "Prepare for any situation." But deep inside, he knew that something about this encounter had changed everything. These humans, these Terrans, were unlike any species the Empire had ever faced before. And they weren't backing down. The Empire's fleet hung in space like a collection of frozen giants, their guns trained on the Terran fleet, but their triggers unpooled. The tension was unbearable. The silence between the two fleets stretched into eternity. The Empire had been the supreme power in the galaxy for centuries, its military might unmatched, its authority unquestioned. But now, here they were, facing a small fleet of human warships, each of which seemed to carry an overwhelming weight of mystery and power. The commander paced the deck of his flagship, his thoughts a storm of confusion. The message from the Terran fleet, simple and direct: "We are the Terrans. You are in our way," had sent a ripple of unease throughout his ranks. The humans were not offering threats, nor were they demanding anything. They were simply stating a fact. The Empire stood between them and something else. What could it be? What could possibly drive these humans to make such a bold statement? "All ships report status," the commander ordered, his voice sharp but his mind still racing. He needed to understand the true nature of this encounter. He couldn't risk underestimating the Terrans. The officers on the bridge scrambled to check their systems, but there was one thing they couldn't explain. The Terran ships hadn't moved. They just hovered there, silent, watching. It was as if the entire fleet was waiting for something. A signal, a decision, a reaction. But from whom? The Empire? Then, as if on cue, the silence was shattered. A new transmission came through, stronger this time. It was a voice, calm and steady, though it echoed through the speakers like a deep rumble. This is the Terran Fleet. We are not here to fight. We are here to change the future. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that none on the bridge could ignore. The commander's heart raced. What did that mean? The Terrans were not here for war. Then what were they here for? The voice continued. You see, it said, we've been watching you. We've been waiting for you to show your true colors. And now, we are ready to show you ours. The Empire's officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected to hear demands, threats, or even a declaration of war. But this? This was different. The Terrans didn't want to fight. They weren't here for conquest. They weren't even here for a battle. They were here with a message. What do they mean by that? One officer whispered. The commander stared at the view screen, where the Terran ships remained poised, unmoving. The silence that followed the transmission was deafening. The Empire's fleet held its position, but no one knew what to do next. The enemy wasn't acting like an enemy at all. They were acting like equals. Without warning, the Terran fleet moved. But instead of charging forward with weapons raised, as the Empire had expected, they simply turned their ships in unison. They made no attempt to advance. Instead, they seemed to be positioning themselves, slowly but deliberately. The Empire's fleet held steady, weapons still ready to fire, but they were no longer sure what they were aiming at. Then, another transmission came through, but this time, it wasn't a voice. It was something far stranger. On the view screen, the silhouette of the Terran flagship appeared, its shape sleek and elegant. But this wasn't an image. It was something much more powerful, an image within an image, a hologram, slowly shifting and warping until it revealed something none of them had expected. The shape was changing. It looked like a weapon. A weapon so powerful it made the Empire's most advanced warships look like toys. The weapon wasn't large, but it pulsed with a strange, glowing energy. A calmness washed over the room. It was then that the commander understood. The Terrans weren't here to fight for territory. They weren't here for revenge. They were here because they had something far greater than war. They had a weapon capable of changing the entire galaxy. The realization hit like a lightning strike. The Terrans were not interested in the Empire's empire. They were after something much more dangerous, the future itself. And the Empire stood in their way. The Empire's fleet was frozen in space, their weapons ready, their shields powered, but no one was willing to make the first move. The commander stood at the helm of the flagship, his mind a storm of confusion and fear. The Terrans hadn't attacked. They hadn't made any demands. They had simply shown a weapon, something so powerful it made the Empire's finest warships look like primitive relics. And with it, they had given the Empire a chilling warning, you are in our way. But the question remained, why had the Terrans come? What was it that they wanted, and why did they believe they could stand against the most powerful empire in the galaxy? The commander's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden transmission. It was from the Terran fleet, but this time, it wasn't a simple message. It was a statement, a declaration of defiance. The voice that spoke was calm, almost cold, but it carried the weight of 100 battles. We are not afraid of you, the voice said, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. We are not here to conquer. We are not here to destroy. We are here to change things. And you will not stop us. The words reverberated through the command deck, and for a moment, no one moved. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of this. The Terrans weren't afraid. They weren't backing down. They had come to challenge the Empire, not for power, but for something far more dangerous. Something the Empire couldn't understand. They have no fear, one officer muttered, a hint of awe in his voice. The commander clenched his fists. He couldn't afford to let the Empire's pride be crushed by the audacity of these humans. He had to act. He had to show that the Empire was not afraid either. "Ready all ships," he ordered, his voice steady. "Prepare to engage. We will show them why they should fear us." The Empire's fleet shifted into battle formation, its massive warships lining up behind the flagship. The Terran fleet remained unmoving, silent, waiting. It was a strange, unnatural calm, one that gnawed at the commander's nerves. It was as if they had already won. But the commander couldn't allow himself to believe that. The Empire's might had always prevailed in the past. This time would be no different. "Fire," he commanded. The order was sharp, and the Empire's guns unleashed a torrent of energy, their beams flashing across the stars towards the Terran fleet. The light of the weapons illuminated the darkness of space, a brief flash of power before the cold swallowed it all. But then, something happened. The Terran fleet didn't fight back. They didn't retaliate. Instead, they did something that left the Empire's fleet in shock. The energy beam struck the lead Terran ship, but it didn't explode. It didn't even flinch. Instead, the ship absorbed the energy, its surface glowing with an eerie blue light. The commander's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't possible. The weapons of the Empire were designed to crush anything in their path. But the Terrans. They had something else. Something far more advanced. Then, another voice rang out from the Terran fleet. This time, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a simple statement. "We are not your enemies. We are here to save you." The words were so unexpected, so completely out of place, that the commander felt a wave of confusion wash over him. Save them? From what? What could the Terrans, these humans, offer the Empire that it couldn't already provide itself? "You have made a grave mistake," the Terran voice continued, "by thinking that power is what matters. You think that might will carry you through. But you've already lost, because you refuse to see what is coming." The word struck the commander like a hammer. There was something in the Terrans' message that rang true. They weren't here to fight. They weren't here to conquer. They had come with something far more powerful than weapons or threats. They had come with a belief, an unwavering defiance against the Empire's rule. And as the Empire's fleet continued to fire, the Terrans remained silent, watching as the weapons that were meant to crush them bounced harmlessly off their shields. The Empire's greatest strength, its military power, was useless against them. Humanity wasn't just defying the Empire. They were showing the galaxy that there was something far greater than power. And the Empire was powerless to stop it. The Empire's warships hovered, their cannons still pointed toward the Terran fleet, but now something had shifted. The fear was no longer hidden, it was palpable, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words hanging in the air. The Terran fleet had proven something no one expected, that the might of the Empire was no match for their power. And yet, the Terrans had not fired a single shot in return. They didn't need to. Their silence had already spoken volumes. The Empire's flagship, once the pride of the military, now felt like a relic. The commander stood at the bridge, staring out at the Terran ships, unable to fully grasp the meaning of what had just occurred. He had been ready to fight, to conquer, but the Terrans hadn't responded the way any other species would have. They hadn't retaliated. They hadn't cowered. They had simply existed. Calm. Unmoved. They were not here for war. They were here for something else. And that something had already been made clear. "Are they leaving?" one of the officers asked, his voice full of disbelief. The commander didn't answer at first. He just watched as the Terran fleet began to slowly retreat, their ships gliding away from the Empire's warships, as if they were no longer interested in the confrontation. The fleet didn't flee in fear. They didn't scatter. They simply withdrew, their movements slow and deliberate. "What are they doing?" the officer asked again. The commander's mind raced. What were they doing? The Terrans had come into the Empire's space, defied them, and now they were leaving. It didn't make sense. If they had the power to obliterate the Empire's fleet, why would they leave without a fight? And then it hit him. The Terrans weren't here for conquest. They weren't here for revenge. They were here to show the Empire that power, as they understood it, was meaningless. That the true strength lay in something else. Something the Empire had long since forgotten. "We're not their enemies," the commander muttered under his breath. "We were never their enemies. We were just in their way." The Terran fleet continued its retreat, its ships moving in perfect unison. The Empire's fleet didn't follow. They didn't attack. They didn't even dare to make a move. There was no longer any need for a battle. The Terrans had already won. And as the last Terran ship disappeared into the darkness of space, the Empire was left with nothing but the remnants of their pride. The commander turned away from the window, his face pale. "Call off the pursuit," he ordered. "There's nothing more to be done." But even as he gave the command, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. The Terrans had shown them a new way of thinking, a new way of power. And it wasn't one the Empire could understand. It wasn't something they could fight. It was something they had never considered. The Empire had been left broken, not by the might of the Terran fleet, but by their refusal to engage in the fight at all. The Terrans had shown the galaxy a new kind of power, one that was not built on force, but on the strength of a simple belief. The Terrans believed they were the future, and nothing could stand in their way. As the Empire's fleet began to turn back, the commander knew they were no longer the masters of the galaxy. Humanity had come, and they had left behind a legacy that would echo across the stars. A legacy not of war, but of change. A legacy that the galaxy would never forget. And the Empire? It would never be the same again. The Terran fleet had come not to conquer, but to teach. And in that, they had already won.